It began like any other high-stakes congressional hearing, with the quiet hum of conversation in the chamber, papers rustling, aides whispering in ears, cameras already rolling before anyone sat down. Outside the building, a few dozen protesters held signs, their chants faint but rhythmic, a reminder that what happened inside wasn't just a policy discussion. It was political theater with real-world consequences. The stakes were high, not only for the individuals involved, but for the millions watching from their phones, laptops, and living rooms across America. On the committee panel sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, a rising star whose blend of legal sharpness, unapologetic conviction, and a knack for dismantling arguments on live television had earned her both admiration and intense criticism. She had faced tough questioning before. She had been insulted, underestimated, and occasionally even mocked. But today felt different. Today, the opposition had a plan, a weapon, carefully chosen, sharpened, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Enter the conservative congressman, a polished operator who had built his reputation on hard-hitting soundbites that played well on cable news. He wasn't there to ask questions in the traditional sense. He was there to set a trap. And as the hearing began, his confident smile betrayed that he believed he had found the perfect one. The topic on paper was judicial philosophy, a conversation about how courts interpret laws, the Constitution, and precedent. But beneath the surface, it was about something else: credibility, identity, and who controlled the narrative in a deeply polarized environment. And so, after a few minutes of dry procedural questions, he leaned forward, microphone adjusted, voice lowered just enough to signal that something special was coming. He began by referencing a figure nearly everyone in the room respected, even if they didn't always agree with her: the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The mention of her name immediately changed the energy. For many Americans, Ginsburg symbolized a lifetime of principled advocacy, meticulous reasoning, and quiet but undeniable strength. Even those who opposed her rulings often admired her discipline and intellect. And so, invoking her legacy wasn't just clever, it was tactical. The congressman reached for a printed page and, with the cadence of someone unveiling a crucial exhibit in a courtroom, began to read from an old speech. It was vintage RBG, measured, eloquent, but with an edge that reflected the complex debates of her time. The excerpt dealt with affirmative action, race-conscious policies, and the delicate balance between opportunity and equality. And as he read it aloud, pausing strategically, the implication became clear. This wasn't just history. This was a challenge, a weaponized quote meant to corner Jasmine Crockett, to force her into either disagreeing with a liberal icon or defending a position that could be reframed against her. For a few seconds after he finished, the room was silent. Not the polite silence of boredom, but the charged stillness of anticipation. Cameras zoomed in. Staffers shifted in their seats. A few conservative members exchanged knowing glances, as if to say, "Checkmate." But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She adjusted her papers, sipped her water, and looked directly at the congressman, not with anger, but with a calm curiosity, as if she was studying a chessboard where a flashy move had just been played, but the opponent hadn't noticed the subtle vulnerability it created. When she began to speak, her tone was steady, respectful of Justice Ginsburg's legacy, but unafraid to contextualize. Justice Ginsburg, she said, was a jurist who believed deeply in precedent, in evolution of interpretation, and in honesty about where the law succeeds and where it fails. Her words from decades ago reflected the legal and social reality of that moment. A moment before key rulings, before shifts in demographics, before some of the very challenges we face today had fully crystallized. Her voice gathered momentum, not from shouting, but from precision. She pointed out that Ginsburg herself often revisited prior statements, sometimes refining them as new facts, cases, and data emerged. Law isn't frozen in time, Crockett continued. Justice Ginsburg's greatness wasn't that she claimed perfection in a single speech, but that she engaged with change honestly, with humility, with rigor, with courage. The congressman tried to interject, but Crockett raised a hand slightly, not rudely, but firmly enough to signal that interruption would look weak. The room quieted again. She pivoted seamlessly, connecting Ginsburg's nuanced views with present-day realities, disparities in education, wealth, and representation that statistics confirmed hadn't disappeared simply because a few decades had passed. She invoked not only data, but human stories, students navigating underfunded schools, veterans returning to unequal job markets, talented young professionals shut out of opportunities by invisible barriers. Her framing was contrast at its finest, respect for history without being shackled by it, acknowledgement of complexity while defending core principles, an embrace of progress that didn't sacrifice integrity. By the time she reached her conclusion, even a few on the other side of the aisle were nodding, not in agreement with her politics, but in admiration of her command of the moment. And then came the line, the one destined to be clipped, subtitled, shared, and remixed across social media within hours. "If we're going to honor Justice Ginsburg," Crockett said, eyes locking with the congressman, "then let's honor her fully, not as a static quotation, but as a relentless thinker who taught us to question, to adapt, and to fight for the America we want, not just the America we inherited." For a heartbeat, the chamber felt weightless, like everyone present had collectively paused to absorb the gravity of what had just been said. The congressman leaned back, a faint grimace betraying that whatever momentum he'd hoped to seize had evaporated. And in the control rooms of multiple news networks, producers were already flagging the clip. On Twitter, where context is optional and virality is king, users were already cutting the last 20 seconds into posts with captions like, "Crockett just ended this dude's career in under 2 minutes." By the time the hearing adjourned, her reply had been viewed over 1 million times online. Within 24 hours, it had crossed 10 million, trending across platforms, sparking op-eds, think pieces, and cable news debates. Even those who disagreed with her politics had to concede it was a masterclass in composure, intellect, and timing, the rare moment in modern politics where substance and performance converge perfectly. What made it viral wasn't just the clash itself, but the layers beneath it. It wasn't a scripted insult or meme-ready dunk. It was the demonstration of something rarer, the ability to meet a weaponized legacy with nuanced respect, to diffuse a trap without dodging the question, to turn a carefully laid ambush into an unintentional showcase of your own strength. And for millions watching, some casually, some emotionally invested, it was a reminder of why politics still matters. Not because every hearing changes lives instantly, but because moments like these reveal who's capable of more than sound bites, who can see both the past and the future clearly, and who, when the cameras are rolling and the stakes are high, can tame pressure into power. But the story didn't end when the gavel struck and the hearing adjourned. In many ways, it had just begun. The next chapter played out not in the halls of Congress, but in the unpredictable ecosystem of modern media, where perception often moves faster than fact, and narrative can outpace nuance in a matter of hours. By that evening, political shows across the spectrum had cued the clip, each ready to spin it through their own ideological lens. On one channel, pundits framed it as yet another example of performative outrage from a politician eager to build a brand on confrontation. On another, commentators praised the surgical dismantling of a bad faith attack, calling it a textbook example of how to defend principle without losing composure. Twitter became a battlefield of edits, captions, and hot takes, each side certain their interpretation would dominate. But no matter how it was framed, one truth was unavoidable. People were watching, and not just passively. In a political culture starved for authenticity, the exchange between Crockett and the congressman hit a nerve. It wasn't just the words, though those mattered. It was the way she held her ground, the way she connected decades-old jurisprudence with the messy, inequitable realities of today without sliding into slogans or empty moralizing. It felt like something rare, a conversation about law and equality that treated the audience like adults, without losing the emotional spark that kept them glued to the screen. For many young viewers, particularly those who had grown cynical about politics, this moment wasn't just entertainment. It was proof of concept, proof that someone could stand in a hostile room, take a weapon meant to wound, and turn it into a shield, then a sword. They clipped it, posted it, texted it, argued about it in comment threads. The algorithms took over from there. By midnight, the moment had been cut into dozens of formats. Short TikToks with flashing captions, longer YouTube breakdowns, Instagram reels with reaction emojis layered over Crockett's calm expression as she spoke. Meanwhile, the congressman who had set the trap found himself in an awkward position. In his world, winning meant controlling the headline, not just in partisan spaces but in the neutral middle, where undecided voters still formed opinions quietly. Instead, the headline had slipped from his grasp. His attempt to corner a rising opponent had turned into a showcase of her agility. A well-intentioned homage to a conservative reading of Ginsburg's words now looked like cherry-picking from a legacy most Americans still viewed with respect. Within his own circles, some urged him to double down, to frame the backlash as proof that he'd touched a nerve. Others quietly advised a pivot, a quiet step away from the exchange before it defined him. But Crockett didn't gloat. There were no victory laps, no smug retweets. Instead, she leaned into the substance, appearing on a late-night show where she laughed off the viral fame, then used her airtime to unpack the deeper issues buried beneath the exchange: structural inequities, the slow grind of legislative reform, the human cost of gridlock. The host tried to nudge her into delivering a snappy soundbite that could double as a clip for tomorrow's trending page. She smiled politely, then redirected. It wasn't avoidance. It was discipline, a subtle refusal to become the caricature her opponents might hope to amplify. Behind the scenes, strategists took note. Crockett's rise had already been on their radar, but this was a case study, not just in policy defense, but in narrative control. She had taken a trap designed to force a wedge between progressives and their heroes and turned it into a bridge, not a perfect one, but sturdy enough to carry the weight of both reverence and evolution. In a polarized era where politics often feels like a screaming match with no winners, the ability to reframe without alienating had become a rare and valuable skill. Academics weighed in next, dissecting the rhetorical strategy like analysts breaking down a championship play. One law professor noted how Crockett's reply mirrored classic appellate argument structure: acknowledgement, distinction, application, conclusion, all delivered with conversational cadence. Another pointed out the emotional intelligence embedded in her pacing, how she allowed silence to do half the work by refusing to fill every beat with defensiveness. Even critics who disagreed with her politics admitted grudging respect for the technique. One conservative columnist wrote, "If my side can't match that level of preparation and composure, we deserve to lose these exchanges." The ripple effects extended into fundraising, volunteer sign-ups, and local organizing. Campaigns often talk about moments, unscripted flashes of clarity or courage that shift perception in ways no ad buy can replicate. This was one of those moments. Donations ticked upward. New names joined mailing lists. Supporters who had been lukewarm grew animated, sending links to friends, telling them, this is what we need more of. Not because one viral clip changes policy overnight, but because it reminds people why they cared in the first place. Meanwhile, in private rooms where party elders traded predictions and quiet bets about who might define the next decade, her name moved a few notches up the whiteboards. No one said it aloud yet. Politics is a game of patience as much as timing. But the unspoken question lingered. Was this the start of something bigger? And still, Crockett herself kept the same rhythm. She didn't inflate the exchange into a manifesto, nor did she pretend it hadn't happened. When asked about it in subsequent interviews, she offered context, humility, a touch of humor. She spoke of Justice Ginsburg with genuine respect, careful to avoid weaponizing the icon whose name had been dragged into combat without consent. It was a masterclass not just in winning a moment, but in stewarding it, in understanding that virality is borrowed attention, and the real measure is what you do with it. All the while, outside the Beltway echo chambers, regular people absorbed the story in fragments. A caption here, a podcast recap there, maybe a conversation over dinner about that congresswoman who flipped the hearing. For some, it was validation of long-held beliefs. For others, it was a first impression strong enough to prompt a Google search, maybe even a follow. And in a democracy built on attention as much as policy, that mattered. By week's end, the noise had quieted a little, as all viral waves eventually do. New controversies demanded fresh outrage. New headlines competed for clicks. But the residue of the moment lingered, in memory, in data, in the subtle recalibration of how political combatants prepared for the next round. Somewhere in a conference room, a staffer likely said, "We need to watch how we frame quotes from revered figures. That didn't work out the way we hoped." And somewhere else, a younger aide probably said, "Find me more like her. People who can win the room without losing the audience." It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't a law passed, a budget secured, or a crisis resolved. But it was a reminder, one that travels quietly through networks of influence and impression, that skill still matters, that composure can be louder than volume, and that even in an era of algorithms and outrage, there is still room for someone to surprise us. Weeks later, when the frenzy had subsided and most people had moved on to the next viral flashpoint, the echo of that moment still showed up in subtle, telling ways. It appeared in think tank discussions, where policy analysts referenced the exchange as a case study in rhetorical resilience. It surfaced in law schools, where professors played the clip to illustrate how context and calm can diffuse an ambush without alienating allies. It even found its way into private emails among advocacy groups, whose members used it to rally volunteers, saying, in effect, "See, we can win even on their terrain." Inside congressional offices, aides revisited strategy memos. What had been planned as a straightforward sequence of hearings now came with a new layer of caution. Quotes from revered figures would be checked twice, then 3 times, for historical nuance. Staffers began role-playing, simulating how a targeted representative might flip a line from a past hero into a weapon of their own. No one wanted to be the next headline of a narrative gone sideways. Meanwhile, Crockett's team treated the moment not as a victory to be polished and displayed, but as a reminder of what mattered most. They analyzed the traffic, not for vanity metrics, but to understand what messages landed, what questions people were asking in the comments, what misconceptions still needed to be cleared. They saw an opportunity to turn temporary attention into long-term trust. They drafted newsletters, scheduled town halls, answered emails personally where possible, each touchpoint a quiet investment in relationships that could outlast any viral cycle. What stood out wasn't just skill but steadiness. In a political environment where every incentive rewards escalation, louder clips, sharper insults, more dramatic framing, Crockett's restraint became its own kind of power. Viewers sensed it, even if only subconsciously, the difference between someone chasing heat and someone guiding it. They saw a politician who didn't mistake the internet's temporary applause for a mandate, who understood that credibility is built one decision at a time, often when no one is watching. This balance, of performance and principle, of moment and movement, is what future campaigns quietly covet. It's why, in donor briefings and closed-door strategy sessions, her name now carried weight beyond her district. She wasn't just another headline machine. She was a potential model. Someone who could hold the complexity of modern politics without surrendering to its cynicism. Someone who could argue fiercely without dehumanizing the other side. Who could take a partisan setup and turn it into a civics lesson that felt less like a scolding and more like an invitation. There's a paradox in modern political storytelling. Audiences want both conflict and hope, both authenticity and polish, both the feeling of a fight and the promise of something beyond the fight. Most politicians can deliver one or two of those at a time. Very few can hold all of them without dropping one. What happened in that hearing suggested, however briefly, that it's possible. The legacy of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg loomed over the entire episode, and that, too, was instructive. Crockett never treated her as a shield or a prop. She treated her as a thinker, a person whose brilliance deserved context, whose influence was living, not frozen in amber. In doing so, she reminded viewers, consciously or not, that progress is iterative, that our heroes can guide us without confining us, that reverence without relevance is just nostalgia in costume, and that, perhaps, is what made her reply feel different from the usual cable news sparring. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a demonstration of how to navigate a country still wrestling with its own contradictions, of how to honor the past without being handcuffed by it, of how to absorb an attack without turning it into spectacle. It gave people something to talk about. Yes, but also something to think about. Something to measure future exchanges against. For all the noise politics generates, the moments that stick often have a quiet core. Beneath the laughter, the tweets, the late-night jokes, what lingered here was an undercurrent of possibility. That politics could still reward preparation over provocation, clarity over chaos, respect over reflex. That a person armed with facts, empathy, and timing could step into a room built for conflict and walk out having done more than went around. They could move the conversation. By the time the clip had been archived, re-archived, and filed into the endless scroll of internet memory, it had done its work. It had reminded one side that their icons are not monoliths but thinkers whose words deserve careful handling. It had reminded the other side that strength need not come from volume. And it had reminded a weary public that every now and then, politics can surprise you in a good way. Months later, when Crockett was asked in a quiet podcast interview whether that day had changed her trajectory, she paused. Maybe, she said, thoughtful. But not because of the views or the followers or any of that. It reminded me, and I hope it reminded some people watching, that the job isn't just to fight. It's to clarify, to connect, to keep the door open for the next conversation. If we do that, even once in a while, maybe we can still earn this democracy we talk so much about. The host let the silence sit for a beat before moving on. The clip didn't go viral. There were no dramatic headlines. But for those who heard it, the message landed with quiet weight. A reminder that the story wasn't about a trap, a quote, or a single chamber. It was about a skill set that, in the right hands, could still shift the ground beneath a debate without tearing the floor apart. In an age of fleeting attention, it's easy to mistake the loudest moments for the most meaningful. But sometimes, the most meaningful moments are the ones that echo after the noise fades, the ones that remind us that politics, at its best, is not about crushing an opponent, but about elevating the conversation. For a brief, unexpected stretch of time, that's exactly what Jasmine Crockett managed to do.